Up to this point in my 386DX build, I have been using this prototype board, the single large PCB, for just learning a bit about the 386DX. The other project I've had going for quite a while is a 286, which I eventually upgraded to a 386SX. And I'm continuing to work on that, but I also want to figure out, what can I learn about the 386DX? And often I'm ordering PCBs that take quite a while, so this just gives me some flexibility to kind of bounce between the two projects as I'm waiting for whether it's PCBs, parts, or something else. Or I'm just looking for something variety-wise to do something a little bit different as I go. So this is the board I've been working with, and I had labeled it version 0.01 just because it really was the first cut at a board. And I laid out things like processor, coprocessor, RAM, ROM, some ISA slots, the two PAL chips that Intel would use in their design, along with a decode. It's a PSOC, a programmable system on chip, and another PSOC that does generation of a bunch of other signals that I need, like clock, reset, A0, A1, S0, and S1 as examples. And so I've been working on that, and this is what that board currently looks like. This mess here, and I've shown this in previous videos, kind of the back of this as I've been going, I've had quite a bit of bodge work, and that bodge work I really wanted to get rid of, because there were a couple times that I actually had one of these solder connections come off, and that is quite a troubleshooting pain, to say the least, when you expect that you had a good solder connection and somewhere physically you broke it off, and then have to troubleshoot that. All of a sudden something changed. I've got this debug card I've been using, and I'm going to go to a different setup for that, but that's been plugging into my ISA slot along with a whole bunch of ribbon cables for extra signals that the ISA slot does not provide. All of this up here was to get me to the point of having a single ROM that gets shadowed into RAM during system initialization. And I was getting to the point of the 386DX, maybe getting to a VIA versatile interface adapter that could get me to my support for SPI, and that SPI would then let me communicate to an Arduino Nano sitting here to my PC, along with SPI from a keyboard mouse controller over here, which is another Arduino Nano. But all of this wire is this is a mess. It's difficult to flip over. It's difficult to just get around with all of this in there. Now, it served its purpose, and that was my intention, is to get something started, but now I need to move on to something different. So I'm going to take this version 01 board, set it aside, and now I'm going to be working on these pair of boards. So I've obviously enlarged it here quite a bit. And if I compare size, I shrunk it in width-wise, but maybe just to turn this so you can kind of see, this is all the new space. So there's quite a bit more PCB space here. Some of it, though, on this is really unused. And I have some ideas what I'm going to put in this, maybe an IDE controller, maybe even a single audio type of chip, something that will generate some level of audio built into the system board itself without a sound card. But I have space to work with, and really the reason I split this up is that I expect I'm going to find changes I want to see, whether they're mistakes or just changes in the design as I'm learning, where I might just want to order just the top half or just the bottom half. I'm hoping the bottom half stays relatively static. There's not much there as far as complexity, so as long as I didn't really screw up something going to any of these connectors, this should stay pretty static. And then this board up here maybe is the one that I'll order, another revision or two before I get too far down the road here. Now, ideally, I'll get all of this populated and working off of this PCB, but there's so many things that I know I could have screwed up as I'm drawing this out. Some of it's already been tested, of course, but some of it is stuff I haven't gotten to yet. Or stuff that's carryover from my 286 build, so that in general, I think I understand what I need for connections and things like that, but maybe there's something on the 386, timing as an example, that I might have to make some changes. So this will expand in the future, but I'm starting with this. It is a very large format. I did keep it 2-layer, so that's one of the reasons it's a little bit big, is just to route a 2-layer with all the signals here ends up being a lot. And I especially found that that was the case when I got into these connectors, these EuroDin connectors. So these are a 3x32. So you've got 96 connectors in this small space. And then I also have these little PCI X4 connectors that I'm going to use just as physical connectors for debug and my logic analyzer. But I found that just 2-layer, getting all these signals into those 4 rows of pins, definitely it's tight and there's a lot going on here. But for now, this is a 2-layer board. If I can get it settled down to the point where I'm pretty confident in the design, I'll try to shrink it at a later point and maybe go to a 4-layer. But this is where I'm at for now. Ideally, I would shrink this down, and what I'm probably looking for is to get something that maybe is about this far out on the board and maybe cut off somewhere in this area right about here. So to trim that much off the board if I can at some point. That is probably optimistic, but that would get me down to an ATX form factor instead of this EATX that I'm working with. Okay, now all of this is going to go into a chassis, and that's what I'm going to start with here. So for the chassis, this is the chassis I'm using, along with the back plate of it. And really this chassis has an ATX form factor that they extended. So they market it as an extended ATX. Basically, it's just a large ATX. And what I am mostly doing is following the hole placement for an EATX. But there were a couple of exceptions that just didn't work for my design. One is these connectors here. This, where I'm supposed to have a standoff, is right in the middle of where this connector needs to be. So these I'm not using. I also added enough holes so that the bottom board has 3 rows of standoffs, and the top also has 3 rows of standoffs. So I'm expecting to have a good solid connection as this all comes together. Now, not all of these holes were there and are in the EATX. I'm not going to call it a standard, but the what I see out there for EATX. So some of these are custom drilled holes, and then I came in with a tap like this. So basically drilled out a hole and then threaded it with a tap. So some of these are custom holes. So if at some point, if I get these schematics or PCB design posted and anybody wants to use it, just keep that in mind. I'm not entirely following the hole placement that you would expect to see on this chassis. I'm using ones that are there, and then I've added some to it, and then I'm skipping some of them. Now, if I can get my boards laid out on that correctly, then I can put on this back piece, this back support for my adding cards. I should be able to come up here. My power coming in will come in here. I'll primarily use a pair of banana plugs. All of my I/O needs to be within this section here, which, that looks like that's not going to be a problem at all. I get keyboard, my mouse connectors. I have a PSOC here that I'm using. Again, this is for my generator logic for things like A0, A1, etc. I also have a PSOC up here for debug. So I try to set it up so those USB connections, if I need it down here, if I ever want to plug in and program it, it's an easy access. If I'm going to connect to my PC up here, that's easy access up here also. And then when I put in the bottom board, hopefully all of these headers, these standoffs, I guess I should say, match up to where they need to, and I'll get a nice good connection physically. And hopefully when these are in the correct holes, if that all works out, I also need to make sure that my connections here for these EuroDins that are connecting my upper and lower board come together. And then I've got some jumpers that I'm going to use for power distribution. So these are 2-layer. I did fill the top and bottom with copper, one VCC, the other ground. So I should have some decent power distribution. I'll find out, I guess, as I get into this. I'll bring banana plugs up here, and then I'll do measuring throughout and just kind of see how well power does get down here. And so that's one area I could have lots of problems. Signal integrity, as I go through this, I could have lots of problems. I'm not doing anything fancy with clock distribution yet. I don't have any type of clock buffer in here yet. Maybe that'll come later on the next revision. I wasn't going to worry about it quite yet. And I think that's where I'm at. So I'm going to set the chassis aside and just work on getting these connectors in here, getting the board together, and then I'll bring back the chassis and see if I can actually screw in each of the standoffs, a screw into each of the standoffs, or if I find any of them that are just not quite right, either because I placed the hole in the wrong location if I was manually drilling it, if it's just slightly off, or if any of these are just slightly at an angle that I'll need to correct, or on my PCB if I just am a little off on the measurements. So I'm going to get my soldering iron fired up here. And I am going to turn on an exhaust fan here. I imagine the microphone's going to pick that up a little bit, but hopefully it's not too bad. I guess it is pretty noisy here, so we'll see if that comes through okay or not. And so these are those first connectors that I want to kind of get in to the system here. So I can pull these apart. Let's see if I can do that carefully without bending any pins here. Okay, so here's my 3 rows by 32 for each of these. And those will come together and hopefully connect up all the signals I need from the top board to the bottom board. So what I'm hoping is that I'll get these soldered in, whichever way I decide to orient these. And then once I get these soldered in and the board connected, I'll drop it on the chassis and see what it looks like. So I think I'm going to start with the bottom board here. So as I've gotten through that, maybe my takeaway is that if I revise either of these boards, my plan will be to actually cut out these pieces. So this will come out all the way across. And then also I would put in the holes for these fasteners, which I did not have. So maybe if I show the back side of it, what that would mean is that I would have a hole for mounting at each of these locations, and there'd be a section here that would get taken out. Now what that would allow is on the other side of this portion of this that's probably intended to be off the edge of the circuit board would drop down, and that would push these pins further through. So these pins right now are just barely through, and as I'm soldering, I'm making sure that the pin catches the tip, just so I know that it's coming through okay. But it's barely coming through, and I like to have more coming through than that. So I will trim out these parts. And I could take another pair of boards, I'm sure, and just quickly route that out myself, but I'm not going to bother with it at this point. But on any revisions here, that would be a set of updates I would make. So 8 holes and trim out this piece here. then as those go in, as these connectors go in, they would be able to sink down a little bit further, and that would be good. Okay, so now with that, then the question is, how does this fit into the chassis? So here's my chassis, lower and upper, and I'll just see if I can screw some of these in. So these are just standard motherboard standoff screws. Okay, so here's where I ended up with this then. It looks like I can do a very minor tweak to this placement. I have any of these that I marked here, like this one, this one, this one, and this one, I need to adjust slightly. And part of that could be because of how this came together, but I'm going to move these. One of these was actually quite a bit off. This one is quite a bit off here. I need to move that hole to the left a ways, so I'll have to measure and see what happened there, because these should be lined up, I think. Again, it could be that that was a hole that wasn't there, which is the case, because that was not part of the EATX form factor, and my drill placement was just poor. So it might not be the PCB itself. It might actually be the hole underneath where I put the mount, the standoff. And that the same would go for this one. So this whole top row, that is probably my error on the drilling, the placement of those holes. These all line up. I got these two. This one's really close, and this one's pretty close. So, but those are the ones I'll have to adjust on any future PCBs or update the board chassis and just fix with those locations. But for now, my biggest concern would be these down here where I'm plugging cards in and out, and then my ROM. And it looks like, I've got a good amount there and there for that. I will pull these P-socks out periodically. So this one looks like I'm good to go. And that one actually won't probably change hardly ever at all. But this one I'll end up pulling. So I've got mount by that. I got a mount by this. So I should be okay. And this feels as good as it's going to get in this chassis. The chassis isn't a super strong chassis, but okay, so I'm going to take that as good enough for now. I think I just have to get, these screwed down the rest of the way, which I just put them in loosely for now, but good enough. And maybe later I can actually just grab a Dremel and just slightly correct these ones that are off just a tiny bit. I might just correct it right on the PCB. But this one, there will be no correcting. That one's too far over. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to go ahead now and take this out of the chassis. Okay, with that, I'm going to put the chassis out of the way and not worry about that for a while here. Come back to that far down the road. For now, I just want to make sure it was close enough so that when I get this, hopefully, running to some level, I know it's going to fit in that chassis. And I really don't need, as I'm going to solder this together, I don't want to work with this as a full set. So I'm going to, of course, pull this apart. And I think the only thing I'm going to populate on the bottom half is power connector, maybe some capacitors, some of these grounds for my scope, and maybe one of these PCIe 4 connectors so that I can just see if I can start to pull like an address off. And I didn't necessarily label these. I'll come back and label those just on the board as far as which signals are in which of these. But basically, one is for address, one is for data. The other two are for miscellaneous control signals. And next, I just got to start populating a bunch of this. And so I've got the processor socket I'll do next. All the caps, I went to surface mount caps, surface mount resistors. So I'll just solder those in by hand. I'm not going to do anything too fancy there. So that'll be the next piece here, is to come in and start getting the core of this ready to receive the different ICs and P-socks that I'm going to need to do.